We are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to BioBridge. It's the first today, directly streaming from my car, my car, Tetsu's car. I'm just outside the studio where my daughter has her dancing lesson. I just brought her from her skating lesson to the dancing lesson, and she's now inside doing her stuff. So, hi Ibrahim. How are you doing?
Doing well, doing well. Nice and hot here
Fantastic.
down in Florida.
Good, good. I was in Florida just last week. It was
You were
it
right
was
in
pretty warm.
Miami.
Not
Yeah,
as hot as I thought it was, which is a good thing.
yeah.
But anywho, we'll have more on my travels later. Today we have Andrew Fleury with us from CJ Partners. I don't know if that name is gonna continue to be CJ Partners, but we'll get into why that question later. But Andrew comes to us directly from Tokyo. Hi, Andrew. How's everything going?
Hello, good afternoon, I believe. Good evening. Things are going well. It's a bright and sunny day after some rain yesterday, so can't complain.
It is. It's not rainy season quite yet in Tokyo, but
No, not
uh,
yet, but it's been
it,
teasing.
it's
How's the
definitely the
how's
allergy
the
season.
no. How are the cherry blossoms? Are they about?
Oh, they're
So the
gone, long
cherry
gone.
blossoms ended about
They did.
3 weeks ago.
I'm like completely out of it. Okay. Dang.
Cherry blossom in Tokyo really peaks on April 1st. Like
Yeah.
I used to work at Izai, and every time we start the new fiscal year, which is April 1st for a good 90% of the company, I think, has that date as the new calendar new fiscal year. And it's always beautiful walking from that station to the headquarters of Eisai. It's always beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah, when you see the cherry blossoms, you really do understand why most of the country operates on the April 1st to March 31st calendar.
Indeed.
Oh, that's
it's
great.
it's lots of hope. It's the smell of spring coming out of cold. Well, a little bit of cold in Tokyo.
Yeah.
It's not the same cold that
Relative
we
to
have here.
Tokyo. Yes.
Yeah, no, nothing compared to Canada or even northern parts of Japan like Hokkaido.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you know Japan pretty well. Let's start there. Andrew, you don't look Japanese, so there must be a reason why you're living in Japan other than just being born there, because you're not born there, I suppose. Tell us a little bit about your background, why Japan, what are the long-term prospects of Japan in your life,
Mhm,
etc. etc.
mhm.
We'll start there. We'll start personal. Get to know you.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on the show, first of all. Um, I'm glad we finally made this work. I'm sorry, my schedule has been so busy. But why Japan is a question I get a lot. And I'll start with what my mother says to people. It's because of Sesame Street. Um, so when I was a kid, there's a little movie, Big Bird in Japan, and you can find it on
Oh.
YouTube now. And the opening scene, Big Bird arrives in Tokyo and he's walking around and everyone's going, Ohio, Ohio, Ohio. So he turns to his companion, which is a giant dog. I forget the dog's name. It's a giant fluffy dog. And he's like, wow, everybody's from Ohio. So funny for a kid, but the rest of that show, like, really made Japan a very interesting place for me. My dad did business here. He was a salesperson for microchips and he was coming out here quite often. His office was in Ebisu. And so when I first came to
Wow.
Japan in high school, I tagged along on a business trip of his, where the trip itself was, but the meetings were canceled, but we didn't cancel the trip. So we just had a trip to Japan. But that was like one of the first places I
Nice.
came to in Tokyo. So that sort of just solidified my interest, having actually had experienced it. And then I was mentioning this to Ibrahim as we were talking before we started, that I actually initially entered university planning to be an aeronautical engineer, but ended up leaving with a degree in economics and Asian studies and continue to pursue Japanese studies as a master's, where I was working on both Japanese linguistics and Japanese history, because initially I was planning to do a PhD in one of those, and I just wasn't sure which. But in the end, I stopped at master's after I saw that it was much more difficult for Japanese academics to get jobs than Chinese academics. Just the geopolitical state of the world. Universities were far more interested in Chinese experts than Japanese experts. So decided to stop at my master's and came out to China, Hong Kong, and Beijing for about 5 years between them, doing something totally unrelated to what I'm doing now, working on an education business and growing and starting that business in mainland China, having grown it out of Hong Kong. And then I came to Japan full-time, you might say, about 2015, and I've been here ever since. So that's my brief why Japan.
A good 11 years.
Yeah, 11 years, maybe 13 in total if I add, the brief in and outs I had.
The bits and pieces. Yeah,
exactly.
So did you join CJ Partners immediately? That was how you ended up in Japan?
Yes. Yeah. So I came out here initially without a job, just looking for one.
Really?
But then the one I found was this one. So.
Wow. You didn't go the English teacher route.
No. I specifically tried to avoid it. I mean, I love teaching. I was teaching when I was in China. I really do love the mentoring aspect of it. But I wasn't teaching English. That was something I specifically tried to avoid. It just wasn't up my interests.
All right.
Yeah, but no, I was fortunate enough to find a job like this.
So for the audience who don't know, CJ Partner is a consulting business that is focused on cell and gene therapy. So, like I said, you did not go the English teacher route and ended up in cell and gene therapy. Not the typical engineer route either for what you wanted to go into at the beginning, right? And then you went to East Asian studies, and somehow you ended up doing cell and gene therapy. So let's dig into that a little bit.
Why? Well, to be perfectly honest, at that point, I was in my late 20s, and I was just trying to get, one foot on the ground, start a new career path. And at the time I wanted to do something, consulting sounded nice, broad, get some experience in a variety of areas. But I wasn't specifically thinking cell and gene. And then what ended up happening is, so the C and J of CJ Partners are two gentlemen by the name of Colin Novick and Jason Seeger, who are Americans through and through, but were raised in Japan. One was born in Hong Kong, one was born in Taiwan, but they grew up in Japan since they were like 3 and 5 years old. But Colin was my senpai. He was my senior at university. So we actually knew each other from undergrad. And they had just established CJ Partners. Sorry, go ahead.
In the States?
Yes, in the States. Colin and I were at University of Cornell in the States. And so
all right. Now now the dots are getting connected.
Yes. So we met there, stayed in touch, and when I reached out to him saying, "Hey, I'm planning to move back to Japan. Do you know anything?" He made some introductions, but then he also had me consider their new company as well. So I ended up joining them as a first employee 11 years ago. And this was, shortly after Dr. Yamanaka won the Nobel Prize in 2012. So this was, 2015 when I joined. Japan was just really gearing up, getting ready to open the floodgates for CGT. The new regulations went into effect in 2014. So it's just the right timing. And, there was still a lack of people who could speak Japanese and English to a degree that would actually be able to navigate working with the regulators, working with Japanese pharma, understand the cultural gaps as well. And I think at that time as well, I was very fortunate in that the industry was still nascent enough that, not to discount all the PhDs and MDs who dedicated their lives to the work, there weren't enough experts in the field that even if you weren't necessarily an expert, if you could navigate it, you were able to contribute significantly. And I think we were able to sort of grow and learn with the industry. Colin is a chemistry major, so he had more of the background there. But that's how I initially joined, and so for the past 11 years, I've been learning and growing with the industry, exercising that STEM side of my brain that I set aside when I switched majors in university.
No,
And it's
that's
been
a great
great.
story. I love stories like these. I know many startup CEOs who have zero science background. They graduated with an economics degree or even an arts degree. And you're on that literature and whatnot, right? Arts side of universities, and you're doing great. And I love it because it just goes to show all these people who think God, I must be the most deepest expert in whatever in order to survive. I mean, no. I mean, if you love it, by all means. But go out and take the leap of faith and try something new, and go to a different country. I mean, you've done all that, So hats off.
Thank you. No, it's been an adventure. Trial by fire. Sometimes get scorched a little bit every now and then, but it just reemphasizes how quickly this industry is moving, and how you really do have to keep on your toes, because it's changing so quickly and it's moving so fast. But I love being a part of it, and it's been a great experience so far as well.
So tell us, what
I
does
really love
CJ Partners do?
So I like to say, we are a consultants. We are consultancy first, but we also have some CRO capabilities. So I'll start with the consulting side, where primarily our clients will usually initially engage us to do some market research, KOL interviews, identify whether Japan is the right market and the right time for them, or if they are certain about Japan, what the approach might be. How are the treatment algorithms in Japan different from wherever the home jurisdiction is, whether it's the US or Europe, Australia, Canada, etc. And then we work with the PMDA quite closely as well. So we are very strong regulatory advisors. We've conducted over 60, I think quite soon over 70 official consultations with the PMDA on the CGT products. And I'm quite confident in saying that I think as a third party, that is as a non-developer, we probably have the most experience with CGT consultations with the PMDA. And it's to the effect that when I go to conferences, international conferences, or even those here in Japan where the PMDA has a presence, quite often, the current head of the CGT review board at the PMDA, he will find me. I don't need to find him. So that's sort of our relationship, which is quite nice to have. Because normally it's the other way around. Everyone's chasing the regulators. But because we've been in it for so long, they recognize us and they understand us. And actually we've had the ability, because, I look like this, but also speak Japanese fluently. If I say my English is 100, my Japanese is probably like a 90, which is sufficient for doing work at the PMDA and pharma companies, etc. And I have a Japanese team, of course, to supplement that. But we can pull out, occasionally what those who in Japan, and I think both of you will understand this as well, that the gaijin card, and pull that out, which gives us a free pass to ask those questions that, maybe a Japanese person might feel a little bit more uncomfortable asking to a regulator in such a formal setting. And we can just pull out, that card and ask the question in a more direct fashion. Or a question that most people just assume this is the answer, but get a clear response from the PMDA that way. And I think that's been a really great tool that we've been able to leverage, and get clearer indications from the PMDA. And of course, through that experience, we'll just have our own understanding now of what the PMDA is actually trying to get at when they say things. And so a lot of our clients have actually come to us from other, big name CRO or regulatory consultants here in Japan, because they thought too much was getting lost in translation, or the interpretations weren't being very clear. So I'd say just shy of 50% of our clients have sort of shifted from those types of organizations to us. So those are our two primary service points, but then we also do some fundraising. We're very well connected with VCs and high net worth individuals here, as well as a little bit in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. We do a little bit of partnering and commercialization licensing agreements with Japanese pharma, or if it's a local CDMO, if there's manufacturing needs domestically. And we also, and this comes to the CRO part, we have the capability of being an in-country clinical caretaker. So a foreign sponsor in Japan needs to have a local caretaker, which they call an ICCC. And so we have that capability to fulfill that role and essentially be a clinical trial project management office. And we are still a small company. We're 6, but growing. And we would outsource to partners that we've been working with over 10 plus years across our experience to do data monitoring, pharmacovigilance, et cetera. So we essentially end up becoming for our clients a one-stop shop into Japan that can handle every step of the development all the way to approval.
Very cool. Do you work with like all sizes of companies, or have you kind of landed more in a niche of some sort?
Yeah, no, I think we work at all sizes. I've worked with companies that are, almost paper companies where there's just a CEO and a couple of consultants fulfilling some of the other roles, very early stage, just spun out of academia, all the way from working with, the large companies like Takeda, Astellas, and things like that. So it really depends on just what the needs are. For larger companies, it's often supporting them when they don't have enough headcount internally. Or if it's for a pharma company in particular, it might be doing some sort of due diligence work for them so they get that third-party opinion. For smaller, medium-sized, it's quite often, especially because most of our clients come from outside of Japan. I'd say about 80%, 70-80% come from outside of Japan. It's bringing that cultural knowledge, linguistic knowledge, the regulatory knowledge of the local jurisdiction, and supporting them in that way because they can cover, whether it's Europe or the FDA. So that's, it really runs the gamut between the size of the company and the stage of the company as well.
That's funny. When you mentioned Takeda and Astellas, I was like, oh, don't they have their in-house? But I guess you were referring to them as local business consulting that you do domestically, I guess.
Yes, yeah, and that was actually working with their Japanese entities, not the U.S. entities, and that was so as a more typical consulting role where they needed a third-party opinion to bring internally.
Gotcha.
That's what kind of what I wanted to get to. You mentioned you joined because you were able to join. You say humbly because the industry is still very nascent. It was new. Everybody was a beginner, and you had the courage to jump in, and you had the connection to jump into CJP. So 11 years down the road, CJP still here is considered a leader, I would say, in Japan, attracting lots of attention from outside of Japan also. So you guys work with PMDA quite a lot. PMDA recently had 2 approvals for the first approvals of IPS. All these new, conditional approval processes. Do you guys have a say kind of in, like, do you think you influence how the rules are getting written in Japan, or do you guys have some sort of in a board meeting that can express opinions on these new processes?
Yeah, so while we have worked quite closely with the PMDA, it is still Japan, right? And Japan means there's processes that all of these go through. And quite often that's still quite guarded. So there are white papers that are issued and feedback is requested, but most often it's the large pharma that is providing that feedback. And it's often sort of I don't know if I want to say an inner circle, but it's a little bit more limited, and so CJ Partners itself isn't influencing it in that way. But I think what we have tried to do over the years is, and this is either whether it's asking questions when there's a PMDA representative that's on a panel, or afterwards finding them, or if they find me and having a short off the record conversation. Raise issues that our clients have been having and questions they've been having and things I've been hearing at other conferences or from even just non-clients and conversations. to get the PMDA's overall thoughts on it. So I would hope that in some way, some of that has trickled in, and maybe they should start thinking about this, because we have started to see some of those changes. But it's certainly, I don't want to exaggerate, the influence that CJ Partners has by any means. But I think, it comes from numerous angles, whether it's from us, whether it's from Japanese pharma, whether it's from foreign biotechs that are trying to get in Japan and say, hey guys, make this easier for us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even the big pharmas are, reaching out to you guys, right? So that says quite a lot. As Ibrahim said, these companies, they have internal expertise, but they have internal expertise in drug development in general, and they do have regenerative medicine and cell and gene and whatnot, but they have their small molecules and all the other domains. So yeah, it's really tremendous to see you guys go about it. So let's get into what BioBridge is really about, connecting Japan and outside of Japan. Let's talk about some differences in the CGT, I guess, domain where your expertise lies. Let's start with some certain things like we talked about some regulatory aspects. What are some key regulatory aspects, differences between Japan and let's say the US, and when companies come to Japan expecting to run a clinical study in Japan, what are the first things that they, the first traps that they got to be careful of, the differences?
Yeah, so the biggest one I would say is I was talking about traps. So if you're talking about like a very early stage, phase 1 type of study, first in human, comparing it against the FDA standards in Europe and Japan. So Europe requires GMP manufacturing from the get-go. US does not. Japan sits in between and requires sort of a GMP-like manufacturing process. They actually have a regulation that's essentially it's manufacturing for investigational products as like a GMP-like standard. But the sort of big asterisk here is you're never audited. The actual only time an audit would take place is when you're applying for your BLA in Japan. So the onus is put onto the sponsor to adhere to the description that they have provided to the PMDA and the consultation process of how things are being manufactured. So it's one of those, we trust you, but if you screw up, you're going to screw up big time. So, make sure you get it right. So there's that element where because of that, because they're not running an audit, there's a very heavy emphasis placed on raw material selection in Japan. And that's historically been the biggest trip up for a lot of companies coming to Japan, whereby some of the materials that would be acceptable for starting a phase 1 in the US, for example, would be unacceptable here. The biggest outlier, and thankfully the industry is starting to move away from this more and more, but FBS, fetal bovine serum, where quite often people are using just a thrice filtered iteration of that in their studies for phase 1. It's a research grade product, but it's considered acceptable enough for a small scale phase 1 in the US. In Japan, the principle is that it needs to be gamma irradiated. If it's not gamma irradiated, then it's not considered adherent to the standards for biological raw materials. But this is also an interesting thing that brings me up to the next point, which about differences is that the FDA, and I think to an extent the EMA as well, and probably MHRA in UK, are a little bit more prescriptive about the regulations. Simple example, the FDA says you have to use a specific type of kit that have been certified for testing for viruses and other sorts of impurities for your safety testing and toxicology testing. So in Japan, it's not prescribed. The general approach in Japan is on the onus again is put on the sponsor to say, this is what we've done, and we think that this is sufficient for these reasons. So there's less prescription in Japan, which on the one hand makes it easier because you don't have to tick all these specific boxes and then run multiple different tests if you're doing one type of certification for the FDA and another type for Japan or another type for EU and the EMA. It allows you flexibility to say, well, we've done this, it adheres to these standards, and therefore we think it should be sufficient for Japan as well. which is great. But on the other hand, it means it's a little bit more of a gray box, and you're not essentially sure if you're going to meet standards until you go and talk with the regulator. So that's, I think, one of the biggest differences. So I know, in the US, pre-IND meeting is very important because it helps finalize your preclinical study pathway and what you're going to need to do in order to open up that first in human trial. And while there is a consultation available in Japan for that, it's an optional consultation. And most of our clients that we've gone so far don't do that consultation, primarily by point of they're already done. No, primarily because they've already done pre-IND in the US, and they actually, most of them have already done clinical in the US. So they might be coming to Japan with like some phase 1 data out of the US, and they're looking to do a phase 1/2 here, or possibly jump straight to a phase 2. But at this, I'm also starting to see now, and I think this trend is a good trend, companies coming to Japan earlier to plan a more global strategy sooner and understand how to position their strategic decisions, whether it regards to manufacturing, raw materials, clinic, and where and when Japan should fit into this puzzle they're trying to piece together. And I think that's the approach the PMDA also wants to see. Because the tagline right now in Japan, right, is this drug lag and drug loss issue, where because of this black box that Japan has been, because there's been a relative lack of communication and regulations translated into English from the regulators and from the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, and there's submitting documentation needs to be in Japanese, so there's this very strong linguistic gap. People they recognize Japan as a big market. It's still, number 3, number 4 in the world, depending on the exchange rate, after China, US, and I think Germany, which is the one that might have overtaken it to be number 3. Yeah. But it's just too much time would need to be spent on it. So they put it off to the end. And by the time they come to Japan, their product has potentially already been approved in other jurisdictions for some time. So I think there was some document, and I should have checked this before we got on the call, but the PMDA put out where I think they were saying something around 80% of cell and gene products that have been approved globally have not come to Japan yet. So they're definitely lagging behind.
Well, so one of the reasons I think this inability of even big companies to include Japan in their pivotal is that CMC is the critical factor in cell and gene therapy, and it's very hard to decentralize the production to run a clinical study that includes Japan within the US or US EU study, right? So how do you think the industry is gonna solve this problem? It's such a costly problem. Will AI make logistics simpler or more efficient, or I don't know what's going to happen? Is the regulation going to change to fit, not to say reality, but make it a little more lenient? What's going to happen?
So actually, I think maybe what's the implication in what you were saying there is there is often a misconception outside of Japan that Japan requires domestic manufacturing, which is not the case.
So that's not really what I'm saying.
So you can. I think I've had a lot of people come to me say, so I understand Japan requires domestic manufacturing. I was like, I have to stop you there. They don't. It is very possible, and we've actually helped companies already do this, run trials with manufacturing outside of Japan, shipping to Japan and administering there. So I think that thankfully the infrastructure for international logistics, whether it's Crowdport or World Courier or Market, etc., is in place, and Japan is a frequent destination to and from for them. So, and when you get here, there are so many logistics providers in Japan that are specializing for cell gene therapies that I actually think that's the easiest part of the puzzle, perhaps.
Fantastic. So this means all these companies should include Japan in their pivotal, and then do a 3-prong application like we used to do in the 2010s, 2012s for all these small molecules. We always run a huge global study, including Japan, and then send out the NDA to the FDA, the EMA, and the PMDA at the same time.
Yeah, and actually that's what the PMDA is trying to encourage as well, because of, again, this drug lag, drug loss problem. They want to see more companies, including Japan, in global studies and not running an independent Japanese trial. And I've actually seen scenarios where when a company has tried to run a local Japanese trial as a standalone, even though they had a global trial going alongside it, the asks from the PMDA were higher for the standalone. But when they repositioned the study to just be a part of the global study, then some of those asks disappeared.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where, and again, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is why I think there needs to be engagement with the PMDA much earlier in the development process and the strategic process to understand how they would be thinking about the product vis-a-vis the current needs and the treatment algorithms in Japan, and also the
why don't you develop a little bit more on that? Then, if I'm a foreign biotech, I'm thinking about Japan somewhere at the corner of my mind. When should I start engaging? Folks like yourself or PMDA. Is this how long before a clinical study, or is this at preclinical stage, or should I, go in after my first in human?
Yeah,
where's the timing?
I think what you want to be doing is engaging before your first in human, but not necessarily. That doesn't mean you're committed to doing a clinical trial in Japan at that time, right? You may still be pursuing a first in human in your home jurisdiction, wherever that may be, but you're engaging the regulator, you're engaging the PMDA on your manufacturing quality consultation, your preclinical safety consultation, to understand whether the work you've done, and I'm assuming you've already done a pre-IND, for example, at this point, right? And so you've already done some non-clinical work on the back of that pre-IND to ensure that you have sufficient data and your manufacturing processes and raw materials are of sufficient quality for the PMDA to then be able to consider at what stage you want to come in. Because if there are gaps, then you say, okay, we can fill these gaps. If we were to do that, could we add Japan to a global phase 2, or would we need to gather phase 1 data? And the PMDA has actually put out some notices saying they want to start steering away from requiring phase 1 trials in Japan, and that's again a part of the move to try to encourage adding Japan to global studies. So I think the earlier you can engage with regulators here in Japan to understand what their thinking will be about your product, the better it is for an early biotech, and the easier it will be for them to think about Japan strategically and understand when they'd come back and re-engage for a clinical study. Because I think if you wait until the time where you think you're ready to run a trial in Japan, it's probably already too late. And there may be things that then end up delaying that because you weren't thinking of it the right way, or the data you collect in these other studies wasn't being examined from the right lens. You didn't have the right patient population for the Japanese patient population, etc. So I think the earlier, the better. And I also say this because Japan always takes longer than people think it will. I will say the PMDA and MHLW have done a great job in speeding things up over the years. For example, the Cartagena protocol consultations and process, which I know the U.S. is not a signatory to Cartagena, but this is for GMOs. So as Japan and like the EU, you have to submit environmental risk assessment for any genetically modified product, and that used to take up to 12 months for review, and I think now they're down to like 3 to 6 months on average. So they've definitely been putting the work in to try to speed things up. But nevertheless, Japan moves at its own pace, and you're not going to, change Japan's pace. You got to go with the flow. So that's why I say earlier is better. There's a lot to learn, and it'll take a little bit more time than you probably are thinking.
Let's dig a little bit more. Just one final thought on this item. If I'm a biotech CEO, I did my discussion with the FDA, and I want to know how much Japan is what are the options in Japan, and how much is it gonna cost me to get that answer? I want to talk to the PMDA. So I got my pre-IND done. Now I want to engage with the PMDA? How much is this going to cost me, and how much time before I get that answer?
So if we're gauging, so we're talking about, let's say they call it the regulatory science strategy consultation is the umbrella term, and within that there's a manufacturing quality preclinical safety consultation. And so these are the two this is technically two consultations run together that you would run prior to doing like a trial design consultation and then submitting your clinical trial notification, which is the equivalent of an IND. At that point, you would run these at least, I would say, 8 to 10 months before you're thinking of starting your clinical trial.
8 to 10 months. Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
So you can run, and this depends on the level of readiness you have. So for example, you haven't engaged KOLs yet. If you haven't really examined the Japanese treatment algorithm and the Japanese epidemia for whatever the indication you're targeting, if you haven't examined that patient population either, you'll need to spend some time doing that, engaging with those partners, finding the right KOL who could then be your potential PI, because you want your PI to be involved in that second consultation regarding trial design. So that's why this can take up to 8 to 10 months. On a strictly minimum time frame, as soon as you have material ready, if you have your documentation ready, which is not a CTD, by the way. I know the FDA requires CTD or ECTD structure for an IND. That's not required in Japan. It's only required once you get to a BLA stage. In fact, the documentation is much more
flexible,
personalized and customized depending on what questions you're going to be engaging the PMDA on. And there's some standard ones, like do our raw materials meet the standards for raw materials, biological raw materials, etc. But you would have very specifically called out items within your documentation. It'll draw heavily on modules 2, possibly 3, depending on the stage of the product, but it is not a CTD format. But assuming you have your documentation in place, you need to run a pre-consultation, then an official consultation. And assuming those two processes run back to back exactly, it's a minimum of 3 months for that. And then you have to do that twice. So, did we lose Tetsu?
Yeah, you can go on. Yeah.
Okay. So if you do that twice, because you'll do it for the manufacturing quality and preclinical safety for one, and then one for trial design, that's at least 6 months. So I always add another, 2 months just in case there's a gap between there. You have to collect more information in between because the PMDA requests it, scheduling issues, and of course you have the documentation preparation itself. So that's where that sort of 8 to 10 month figure comes from. And depending on the nature of the product and how ready the company is coming in at that stage, you might be able to run some of these in parallel, which of course will reduce the time quite significantly. But that then is a pretense upon the fact that you've already engaged in Japan before that, right? Which goes back to the original point of come in earlier than you think before you're ready to engage in a clinical trial, so you can start to think about these things and lay the groundwork. Because Japan is, and the way I've been talking about as well may come across this way, but I don't want to be misunderstood. Japan is it's not a regulatory play. It's not a document play. And I think that's sort of been top of mind for most people, simply because that's where the biggest hurdle is linguistically and the fact that it's quite different from the FDA and EMA in various respects. But it is mostly harmonized, but there's just little areas that are different. Yeah. It is really about a relationship building game, right? Yeah. So I think that's why you need to come in earlier. And it's relationship building, not with just potential partners or potential PIs, but also the PMDA. Engaging with them sooner, having established that track record is also really important to making sure your product is understood.
Yeah. So one of the things I always want to ask is, why go through all this trouble? I know you hinted on it, right? So, like Japan is number 3, number 4 market size, whatnot. However, how is that different is it different for CGT? 1. Mm-hmm. And then 2, nowadays there's an issue with most favored nation pricing. And, Japan has historically been a lower price. So there's sequencing also that comes into play in terms of approval. So can you tell us kind of like the landscape of Japan in terms of CGT, as well as kind of, I guess tell the audience why Japan? Does it justify having to plan all this 10 to 12 months ahead and all that?
Yeah. So I think, and actually CGT, the biggest advantage I think Japan has, specifically for CGT, when it comes to, in the end, what is it that we're getting out of this, right? In the U.S. in particular, I think less so in Canada, and Europe depends on the country, but I think less so there as well, right? The multi-payer system is a massive headache, and especially for these one-time cure types of treatments, the gene therapies that are coming in that are asking very large price tags, more than $1 million, more than $2 million, more than $3 million sometimes. Obviously, those have struggled in the U.S. So where Japan comes in is you have national health insurance, single payer, everybody's on it. And because the regulators, so this is the Central Medical Council under the MHLW that helps define the reimbursement price in Japan. Because they have a say in that, once you get your price, even if your price is, somewhere between, maybe like 70% of what you could have gotten in the US if you were setting your own price, you have 100% of coverage. You're not having to worry about whether or not and spend the resources on negotiating with multiple payers, whether or not your product will be covered under Medicare or Medicaid. So you have a much easier access to market. And Japan has, these rules in place as well for people under insurance, where even if it's a very large, price tag on a product, especially if it's for pediatrics, there's a maximum amount a family will spend out of pocket on that. And it's incredibly low. It's very accessible. I have a friend whose son was diagnosed with SMA. One of the less severe types, thankfully. But he was, about to move to the US when COVID hit. But son was born, they stayed, he was diagnosed, and he's so thankful he's still in Japan because the out of pocket he's paying is pennies compared to what he would have been paying in the US. So I think, especially for CGT, because these are high priced products, even if the price is, lower than you would traditionally get in the US, it's not too significantly lower. I think there's been, and I can't say this off the top of my head, so please don't ask, but I know there's been 1 or 2 cases where it's actually been higher than in the US. But it's in my opinion, a much better exercise potentially for these types of products, because you're spending way less resources on those negotiations and you have the coverage. So even if your per product cost is going to be less, you're going to have far more sales moving forward. And I think the total revenue can have the potential to be much greater, at least, the short midterm, as you work out the kinks with the multiple payer system in the US.
Yeah. But from what I know, at least advertised, Japan is working on its pricing model and whatnot. And I'm wondering if CGT is kind of different from small molecules in terms of how it's approaching this. Why? Because, it is more innovative, for example. And, I believe, I can't recall exactly the source, but Japan does tend to favor shorter treatments over more chronic treatments, if that's if I'm remembering correctly.
So I think patient burden is an important aspect in Japan, and I think this probably stems from the large elderly population as well. But on the other hand, sort of on the flip side, hospitalization in Japan is not as burdensome as it is in the US from an economic perspective, right? So I've seen, clinical trial protocols in the early days where people were hospitalized for 30 days at a time, which obviously is high patient burden, having been stuck in the hospital for 30 days at a time. But economically, it's feasible because of the healthcare system here. So when going to your question, I think that the short-term, less chronic treatments and more short-term treatments is predominantly to reduce the patient burden, but not necessarily one where they're going to shy away from a treatment if it has, a higher dose frequency or a longer dose frequency over an extended period of time. I think what really matters in the end, as this is coming out from not from a regulator perspective, from the doctor's perspective, right? Is this treatment going to work? Is this going to bring a better quality of life to the patients, because the doctors have a significant level of influence here. So in Japan, there's numerous academic societies that very often are putting out guidelines, and they're the ones that define the treatment algorithms.
Yeah.
So if they are saying like this is and you want to engage with those academic societies early on, when you come to Japan with a brand new product with new technology, new mechanism of action that's going to be an absolute game changer, you want to engage with those societies, have early discussions with them. Sometimes they'll even preliminarily make mentions of the product that is, in development as, what could be a game changer for the treatment algorithm. And that is very useful when talking with the PMDA or the Central Medical Council and having your pricing discussions. And that often leads to some of those premiums that you would be able to get when you have your reimbursement pricing. So that's the best way to, and this goes back, again, to the same thread we've been having: engage early, have conversations, build relationships.
Very cool. And then, so Tinsu, you mentioned earlier about iPSC approvals. We're talking about heart failure and Parkinson's. And it's very recent, but have you seen any kind of increased interest from ex-Japan coming into Japan because of, perhaps Japan being in front line of iPSC approval now?
Yeah, I think every time I talk with a company that is working on something iPSC related, Japan comes up, but it's often in passing. And I think it goes back to the more fundamental problem of the black box issue that we talked about earlier. So I think that, these conditional approvals, while exciting, I'm still waiting to see what will actually happen, right? We've already had, so there's 8 total conditionally approved products right now. Of those 8, 2 were withdrawn from market, Heartsheet and Coladogene. So we've not had any successes transition from conditional approval to full approval. And for people who aren't, more aware of this, right? Conditional approval is technically not a pathway. It's not a separate pathway. It's not like an accelerated approval in the US. It's actually more of a choice for the PMDA when reviewing a BLA application, in that instead of saying a binary yes or no, they can now give you a conditional approval, but the documentation is all the same. And when you get that conditional approval, right, it's term limited up to 7 years. There are other conditions depending on the mode of administration, the target indication, and usually you're only able to provide it at hospitals or clinics that have experience with the product or sufficient expertise. And if these are very new products that require a specific level of experience, it means quite often it's only the hospitals that participated in the studies in Japan. But during this time, you are covered by reimbursement, which is great. You're getting paid, and patients are getting the product. You don't get any premiums, however, that you would get outside of conditional approval. But within the term of your conditional approval period, you have to collect sufficient patient data from those patients you are treating to then submit for full approval before the end of that term. And that's where both Coladogene and Heartsheet failed to get a sufficient data set to prove their products were working to a degree that made the PMDA feel comfortable to give their full approval. So while Amteri and Reheart are exciting as the world's first IPS conditionally approved products, the data sets were quite small. And so I think there's a lot to be seen from here to see how well it's actually going to work, especially over the long term, considering the targeted nature of the target indications of these products.
Yeah. Oh, very cool. A lot of new stuff.
It's not. So okay. So I learned. I thought it was a separate pathway where you go for the conditional approval, accelerated approval. So it's not. It's basically you just apply as you normally would for any full approval, but the PMDA can come back and say, well, we're going to give you a conditional early approval.
Correct. So it's not like you're not applying for any sort of designation or anything beforehand. During your consultations with the PMDA, when you're talking about your clinical development strategy in Japan, if conditional approval is something you want to consider or be considered for, you would make mention of that because that'll impact your trial design. You want to make sure your trial is designed in a way that where the PMDA is feeling comfortable that they're going to get enough data for them to be able to make such a decision. So you have preliminary conversations, but it's not a formal new channel that you're going through.
All right. As interesting as this discussion is going, and we could go on forever, I am seeing that we're almost to the top of the hour, and we haven't talked about the elephant in the room yet. So, as I mentioned, CJ Partners is so well known in the industry within Japan. I didn't even know it was so well known outside of Japan, and it caught the eyes of a very big consulting firm called Dark Horse Consulting, and I was at JP Morgan. So I met them last year, 2025, when Cell and Gene was still very quiet. This year, 2026, the room was packed. So they're talking about, the investors are coming back, etc. And they had this whole panel talking about going to China. And I talked to the organizer, well, the head of the Dark Horse, Anthony Davis. I said, why are you guys not talking about Japan? We got to talk about. And then he says, we almost had Japan on stage, but we couldn't fit it into the schedule. And keep your eyes open. In a few weeks, we're going to have a big announcement about Japan. You're going to like what you hear. This is January. A few weeks down the road, we're talking February, March, nothing happened. I thought, I wonder what that was about. And last week, ta-da! I didn't know it was so close. I didn't know it was so close to the people I knew. So tell us about what happened last week, what the announcement was, and all the implications.
Sure. So as of April 16th, CJ Partners has become a fully owned subsidiary of Dark Horse. So we are now still CJ Partners, but as you can see, here we go, a Dark Horse group, consulting group company. So we've joined the likes of some of the other recent acquisitions like Biotech Logic and Converge Consulting, and will now sit alongside them in that respect. So Anthony wasn't wrong. The hopes in January were just a couple of weeks, but as these things do, they always take more time than one expects. But yeah, so this has been in the works actually for quite some time now. And Dark Horse and CJ Partners actually has quite a long relationship together. We very neatly didn't step on each other's toes. So we've been able to make client introductions back and forth in the past, and actually even work on a couple projects together in the past as well. So, I'm glad to be a part of the stable, as they say now. And it's going to certainly help.
You didn't let any of this leak out from our discussions during our little tea time in Ueno or wherever we were.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, especially considering we're live on air.
Of course.
But yeah, no,
I had no clue. My goodness. For a long time. Yeah. No, this is great because I see two giants, one in the U.S., one in Japan, shaking hands, collaborating, and I see lots of great ideas and projects that's going to go in and out of Japan, and the flow of information, the flow of knowledge, the flow of technology. It's just going to get boosted on steroids. So this is tremendous news. I was very happy to hear that. And
thank you. Yeah, we're excited as well because I think for us, we've been our focus has always been and only been the PMDA, right? We are Japan experts. We don't do any work outside of Japan from a regulatory standpoint. So to be able to now offer our Japanese clients and non-clients, but new Japanese biotechs that are getting founded and looking abroad, because I think that's actually part of the trend. And I know we don't have any time to talk about this, but Japanese biotech is now really understanding that to be successful, especially given the funding environment, they need to go to the US or Australia or Europe first and engage also with investors and KOLs in those areas in order to get sufficient funding to be successful. So to be able to now be a bridge in the other direction, or rather have two directional flow of traffic instead of just a unidirectional flow of traffic. I think that's really exciting for us to be able to offer that in a new way and be supportive of that. And then because Dark Horse, a lot of their clients, while they do support the gamut of development phases, a lot of them their clients I think go to Dark Horse quite early, given their deep technical expertise as well. So I think going.
No, and I was going to say they're a huge network of investors behind them, right?
Yes.
So
yeah, and so I think their clients that are early stage, going back to what I mentioned in the beginning of when they're coming up with their global development strategy. Now there's the ability for us to add more insight onto Japan as well. So I think this is going to be really exciting for both sides of the large pond that is the Pacific, and very looking forward to seeing how it goes from here. It's just getting started, so lots to see.
Exciting times ahead. Exciting times ahead. Ibrahim, do you have any questions that don't open a can of worms, but just branch out a little bit before we?
I wanted to open. We always talk about obviously culture gap and whatnot, and you had brought up the Gaijin card. I wanted to let me end at this. Pitsu, do you have the Gaijin card or no? You can't.
I have it everywhere I go.
No, but in Japan though, I don't know. A lot of it's like appearance based.
Yeah.
You do it so well, right? Do you get to pull it in Japan?
I sometimes. Yeah, because Tetsu Young with the name that's at least the name reminds people that I'm not fully Japanese. So, but if it's just speaking with me, then they sort of forget that I'm not fully Japanese.
Yeah.
So I get the best of both worlds. I always see this as getting the best of both worlds.
Right. Well, let's leave it at that. I was gonna open a bigger can of worms, but
well, let's finish with Andrew's forecast for the next 1, 3, 5, 10 years. What's gonna happen in the industry, in Japan, in the world? I see so many positive stuff coming out. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple elements that we'll see for Japan. First is, as I just mentioned, right, a lot of technology is now being examined by cross-border investors or investors in Japan that are more familiar with taking products outside of Japan, and I think that's going to be a really big trend we see moving forward. Some of the leaders in this right now, Saisei Ventures is really big on this. They're the VC based out of Toronto, Japan, Boston. And there's a couple more that are more based in Japan, F Prime, 8 Roads, some of those tied to larger capital, helping companies establish and then go into the US. So you see Shinobi Therapeutics, for example. I think that's number one. I think number two is, there's been big news in sort of a different respect. For example, back in October, Takeda announced they're pulling out of cell therapy after decade of doing T-Syra, which was the Takeda and Syra collaboration with Kyoto University and Dr. Yamanaka's labs. But I think that's going to be a temporary shift. I do think they'll probably come back to play once the industry has proven itself a little bit more. And I think Japan is
funny
going
that
to
you
be
mentioned that, because I literally heard somebody else talk to me about Takeda in interaction with CGT, like just literally today. So it's like maybe they're not pulling out completely, or like you say, maybe they'll come. They're still kind of like they'll come back. But yeah, that's a good trend.
Yeah, I think it'll be. It's a shift. I think what's happening is a shift from, and Takeda was doing a lot of this, and this is what they were doing at their shown on iPark for a while, is a lot of early stage assets, and they were investing and putting out option agreements for early stage preclinical assets. But I think what people have learned is, while the science may seem good and seem interesting, the practicalities, the manufacturing, the scalability weren't there yet. That even just the technology in general wasn't there yet to be able to provide these potentially excellent therapies at a scale that would be necessary to make financial sense. So I think as that aspect of the industry starts getting better and better, we're going to see these companies come back and acquiring and being more interested in later stage assets that have proven out the manufacturing portion and the stability portion. Because I think that's what they're interested in now. They're not interested in necessarily in exciting science. They're interested in science that is executable. And I think that's really an important trend that we're going to see. So I think we'll find more companies coming to Japan in that sense. And then I think those companies that are founded outside of Japan that have sufficient funding are going to come to Japan potentially on their own and try to start establishing some subsidiaries here to develop in Japan, because there's a lot of AMED funding available now as well, which is a whole nother topic, where AMED will essentially put 2x on top of a certified VC investment, but it has to go into a Japanese entity. The money can be used globally, but I think the fact that you might already have a Japanese entity might encourage these companies to then approach Japan on their own potentially, or at least have a more early stage engagement with these potential partnerships they would have down the line. So I think that's sort of the key thing moving forward. And there's probably going to be an overall shift, I think globally, not just with regards to Japan, about not thinking so much about various jurisdictions as just a new market, but as a sort of new collaborative strategic opportunity. And that's going to shift the mindset to thinking earlier and thinking about it more strategically, rather than just running through a standard set of rules and routines that maybe people got used to when developing, as you mentioned, earlier, small molecules, right? They're more easily understood, they're more homogeneous, and that doesn't work for CGT. So I think people are going to start recognizing that this is a process, this is a relationship, this is a collaboration with regulators, with pharma companies, with distributors, with manufacturers. And it's going to change the overall approach to not just Japan, but I think any jurisdiction outside of a company's home jurisdiction.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your expertise, your know-how, and congratulations
Thank you
again
very much for having me.
on tremendous milestones. And hopefully
Thank
we'll
you.
do this again.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. I know it's taken us a while to put this together, but I'm glad we did it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you from me as well.
And excuse me for jumping in from my car. All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much to the audience, and we'll see you guys in a few weeks again. Bye-bye now.